Welcome everyone to the KSAC webinars. Today we are going to be talking about consent, and this is going to be aimed towards grade 11 and 12 students. To briefly introduce ourselves, my name is Alicia Fisher. I'm the Prevention Education Supervisor with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center.
Hello everyone, my name is Lucas Schaefer. I'm the Mending Coordinator at the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center.
Great, excellent. So let's get going. I'll share the screen here. Fabulous. So let's get talking about consent, one of my favorite topics. So what we're going to be going through today is a brief overview. We're going to talk about who we are, what the importance of consent is, and even in our everyday lives, as well as cycling through consent consensually, but things change, and that's okay. So we're going to be talking about the cycling through consent video. It is very similar to the consented tea video, but this one has more nuances that can be connected to sexual connections regarding consent. And then we're going to talk about the age of consent and substance use and how that can start to muddle things, but really it's not muddled because of laws. But we'll get more into that and supports and resources here. Okay, so who we are at the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center, we support all individuals who are impacted by sexual and gender-based violence. So not only do we offer support for youth and adult survivors of current and historical acts of sexual violence, but we also support their supporters. So that could be a friend, family member, or a romantic or intimate partner. We also offer advocacy and accompaniment supports. So if you're needing court support, reporting to police support, going to the hospital support, we do offer those accompaniment services. On the other side, we have public education. So this is outreach to kindergarten through all the way through high school, college, university. Some of you we may recognize each other. And we even talk to community spaces and athletes. And then we also have our mending program.
Thanks so much, Alicia. Yeah, so the mending program is, as Alicia was talking about, on the public education and prevention education side of things. It's a male ally leadership program that's pointed and wanting to engage men in ending gender-based violence. So in this program, we talk about what is gender-based violence, what is sexual violence, what is consent, what are healthy relationships, what can we do to intervene. We learn about bystander intervention, and then at the end of the course, we talk about how we can teach these topics to people that we have in our lives and as well as ourselves. Just ongoing knowledge is a big tenet of the program. But if you want to learn more about the different topics that we talk about in the mending program, we're going to be having a mending related webinar this week talking about healthy masculinity. So stay tuned for that.
Certainly. And then we do offer 3 different 24/7 crisis support services. So we have our phone line, text support, as well as our online web chat supports. Those numbers will be available at the end of this presentation. We are also very well connected with Nich Quinidad Anishinaabe Koiwag Service Circle. So this is Indigenous supports and resources for healing for individuals as well as family members who have been abused, are being abused, or at risk of being abused. So this is all healing work using traditional Indigenous healing spirituality and connection, as well as a variety of other methods. So there's a variety of programs here, but it's not limited to the Healthy Babies and Healthy Children program, housing support, crisis and short-term counseling, youth services, and cultural training. And why we're so connected with them is that we actually share a floor with them at our Peterborough office. And I always mention this after we introduce ourselves, but our catchment area for the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center is Peterborough, the Kawartha Lakes, Haliburton, and Northumberland. If you reside outside of those areas, there's actually a support that you can reach out to find what is your sexual assault center in your area, and that is Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers, and they have like a Find My Center option on their website. So let's get into consent. What is consent? Now, I'm sure we've had plenty of discussions about this, but Lucas and I did a video that really kind of broke down not only the beyond the yes and no binary, but paying attention to our body language, our vocal cues, and our facial expressions. But we also incorporate 4 different concepts of consent that are very important to understanding what consent is and how it impacts us.
Awesome. So while Alicia is setting this up, we might be familiar with consent and knowing it by a kind of basic, boring definition that's useful, but not the whole picture. It being about the agreement or permission to do something, right? Really, really vague. So in this video that Alicia was talking about and set up for us, we're going to be exploring that and looking at how we can make sure that that definition is full and complete.
When we're talking about consent, yes, it happens in everyday life, but something that we have to remember is that, of course, it happens in our intimate life as well. And we're going to be going over 4 key components, but with those 4 key components, keep in mind that we have to look out for verbal signals, body language, and facial expressions as well. So let's see what those 4 key concepts are.
Awesome. So the 4 principles that we talk about when we talk about consent are freely given, mutually agreed upon, enthusiastic and clear, and repeated and reversed. So let's go into detail with these principles one by one.
So freely given is that we are able to freely decide and say what it is that we want or don't want to do. In the definition here, it says consent is never coerced. So we're never threatening people, and you never have to feel threatened to have a response, to say what you want to say. And it's always between sober folks. Of course, this is a legal definition, but keep in mind, when we're engaging in intimate practices and we're impaired, maybe we feel pressure to do something, it ultimately restricts our options and increases the chances of harm occurring. So you think about signing up for a bank account. They're not going to allow you to sign up for a bank account while you're impaired or to drive a car. So why? Because your thinking is impaired. Your ability to make rational decisions or maybe ethical decisions is impaired when you're not sober, when you're under the influence of a substance. So when substances are involved, there is an increase of harm that's happening. And it's kind of illegal. Things to keep in mind.
And the second principle is that it's mutually agreed upon. So this principle about consent really emphasizes that consent is an interactive process, right? It's something that not one party or one person is going to be making all the decisions for. Every single person and all parties need to be willing and wanting for this thing to happen, right? And a part of that piece is that they're informed about what's happening, right? So this is going to be talking about what we want before we do it, right? And really emphasizing that like this is something that everybody wants and not just one person wants.
And when we're talking to people and hearing about what they want, we have to make sure that it is enthusiastic and clear. It's active, it's obvious. And so hearing things like this feels good or keep going are really great indicators. But sometimes we hear things like sure and uh-huh. How do we know if that sure is a yes sure versus that sure being a no sure? Well, obviously keeping in mind our verbal cues, facial expressions, and body language, but the best thing that you can do is ask. Do you like that? How does this feel? Are you enjoying this? They are all great ways to check in.
And our last principle is that consent is repeated and reversed. So this really emphasizes that consent is an ongoing and continuous process, right? It's not just about an initial yes and a yes to every other action thenceforth, right? You're going to be open to yeses and nos changing, right? A yes can initially become a no, or a let's try something else, or a maybe later, right? So a key part about consent is that you're ready and open to what we were talking about before, those facial, verbal, and body language cues to indicate those ongoing continuous yeses. And something to keep in mind is that you can always stop, right? Just because you said yes before does not mean that you have to go, you have to keep going, right? It's a continuous process. You can say no, you can change your mind. Yeah.
Awesome. So again, consent is freely given.
Mutually agreed upon.
It's enthusiastic and clear.
And repeated and reversed.
Fantastic. I love that video. You know, one thing with consent is that a lot of how it's framed is solely within this sexual and intimate connections. And yes, that's 100% part of consent, but consent is really part of our everyday lives, but asking to borrow someone's pencil or pen during class, after we sanitize it, of course. Before we answer a question, we put up our hand. Like, that is a form of getting and giving consent. So yes, consent is part of our everyday lives. It's also part of our intimate lives as well. So now we're just going to go into when is someone unable to consent? Lucas?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alicia. So kind of like gestured to in the video that we saw before, people aren't able to consent when they're intoxicated. And this is the part of the of those 4 principles freely given, right? That idea that it has to be unimpaired, unhindered, just you, right? And when we're intoxicated and when we're under the influence, we're not as uninhibited as we would want to be in order to be willing and able and ready to like perceive these cues of ongoing consent that we need to make sure that whatever's going on is healthy and great for everyone. You also can't be you can't consent when you're not conscious, barely conscious, passed out, asleep, and etc. This might seem commonsensical, but it's really important to mention. If you can't hear, if someone can't communicate to you in a way where you can like understand that they're willing and wanting to do something, then they aren't able to give consent, period. And people who are underage are unable to give consent. We're going to give a lot more context to this later. Just keep in mind that it has to do with legal laws as well as power imbalances and navigating those power imbalances. And someone who is unable to understand what is being consented to cannot give consent. And the reason why that is because you have to make sure that you're fully informed in order to have a full like a full kind of consent, right? Because you can't agree to something fully if you don't know what you're agreeing to, right? Something that Alicia was talking about how we can apply consent in our everyday lives, right? Imagine that you're going out recess with a friend and they wanted to play some social distance sport, right? And they said, hey, do you want to play sports at recess? And you're like, yeah, I love soccer. Soccer's great. I'm really good at soccer. Let's do it. And then you go outside for recess and it's football. And you're like, what? This isn't what I agreed to. What's going on? Right? So in order to have a full understanding of consent, we need to be informed, clear and simple. And we can't provide consent if we're being threatened, pressured, or coerced. And this goes in tandem with the freely given aspect of consent, right? We want to make sure that when we're consenting, it's uninhibited, it's us. And when someone's pressuring and threatening us, that affects that. Yeah. Thanks, Alicia.
Definitely. So now we're going to go to another video about cycling through consent. And as I mentioned, this is similar to the teen consent, but has more variables that talks about the different nuances within consent, right? So the teen consent is if you're asleep, you can't give someone tea if they're asleep. But so this talks about riding a bicycle and the different things that we need to look out for when we're engaging in a bike ride or when we're engaging in intimate connections. So there will be some sexual innuendos that you'll notice throughout this, but that really goes hand in hand, because it seems as if once we get to the sex and relationships part of consent, we tend to get confused and really forget that consent really comes down to respect and respecting someone's wants, wishes for what they want to do. We'll talk more about pressures after this, but let's just watch here.
Only 1 in 3 Canadians fully understand what consent is. So Western, let's talk about it. Let's think about consent like a bike ride. If you wanted to go on a bike ride with someone, you'd say, hey, I'd like to go on a bike ride with you. And they'd be like, hey, I'd like to go on a bike ride with you. Boom. Put on your helmet, kid. You're going on a bike ride. You might hear things like, this feels great, or keep going. These are ways you know they're enjoying the bike ride. Maybe not those ones. If they said no, then that's that. They do not want to go on a bike ride with you. You don't toss them up on a bike and say, oh, come on, it'll be fun. No is no. And if they don't say anything at all, it's still a no. The absence of a yes is a no. They could say, heck yeah, or I might want to. And you put on your biker shorts, get the bike, grab the helmets, and in that time, they decided that they don't want to and start to backpedal. And that's okay. They aren't obligated to go on that bike ride. You'll just have to bike on your own. Oh, and being dressed in bike shorts and a helmet doesn't automatically mean someone wants to ride a bike. It's quite presumptuous to think they do. Even if you happen to be in a relationship with your bike partner, you have to ask each and every time. Say your bike partner has had a couple of drinks, and we're not talking about water. They're not ready to go for a bike ride, even if they've told you they are. A drunk yes is not a sober yes, and by law, you need a sober yes. Oh, and just because you bought them drinks all night, it does not entitle you to a bike ride with them. Same rules apply if they're unconscious. The conscious people can't ride bikes, and they definitely can't say yes to doing so. The number one priority is to make sure they're safe. Even if they're just sleeping, they can't say yes to a bike ride. And it can be a scary thing to wake up and find yourself on a bike. Imagine your boss telling someone, you can only work here if you bike with me to work. That's crossing the line. It would be an abuse of power for a boss or a person of influence to suggest such a thing. And just because someone wanted to go for a bike ride once, doesn't mean they'll want to every time. Maybe it was just a one bike stand. You can't say, what are you talking about? We biked last night. You're simply not entitled to another bike ride if they don't want to. Maybe your fellow cyclist is totally cool with biking on paved roads. That does not mean that they are up for extreme mountain biking. You're not going to insist that they go speeding down a mountain with you if they are only interested in paved roads. That's uncomfortable territory, and you don't want to pressure your bike partner, do you? What if Alex here told you that Taylor really wants to ride bikes with you? Does that mean you throw Taylor up on a bike and say, all right, let's start pedaling? No. The only person that could say Taylor wants to go for a bike ride is Taylor. When all is said and done, riding a bike with someone should be fun, memorable, and hey, maybe a bit sweaty. But it can only be that way when everyone involved has willingly agreed to participate. So whether it's having sex or bike riding, consent is key.
Okay, great. So here are just some key points and throughout that video about cycling through consent, but also how these can be related to our more intimate connections and sexual connections with other folks. So putting on a helmet, practicing our safety is our number one priority. We need to be safe. So whether it's riding a bike and putting on a helmet or engaging in intimate connections and thinking about the possibilities of STBBIs and the possibility of pregnancy, using protection should be a safety measure that you're not only thinking about, but discussing, right? So you don't want to be grabbing an external latex condom and have that touch your partner only to then realize that they're allergic to latex. So these are really important conversations to have prior to engaging on a bike ride or engaging in intimate connections. Another thing that was really great to know is what kind of terrain, what are the clear set of expectations of what this bike ride is going to entail? The definition of sex to one person may be very different to what sex means to someone else. So you have to describe in detail what it is you plan on doing. And so whether it's riding through mountains on paved roads or engaging in penetrative sex or just oral sex, you need to have those conversations prior to, so that way you can just define what it is you're fully consenting to. You need a sober yes for both cycling and sex. You cannot consent under the influence of a substance. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but ultimately what it comes down to is that when you are impaired, when you are under the influence of a substance, you aren't able to have clear, rational decision-making skills. So it's really important that you have a clear, sober state of mind, not just for the respect of your partner, but also thinking about the legal implications connected to that. And Lucas, do you want to continue with the last three?
Thanks, Alicia. We need to, and something that was in that video that was featured was that we need to ask for consent every time, even when you're in a relationship. We don't want to assume that someone's always up for a bike ride or having an intimate connection just because they're in a relationship with us, right? We want to make sure that that's something that they want to do. So checking in is always is necessary in order to be safe and healthy. Something else that we saw in that video were that people are allowed to stop at any time, and you need to respect that. That repeated and reversed principle that we see. That a yes can become a no can become a yes can become a maybe later. And it's something that you're continually checking in and knowing that you can say no and stop at any time. And
sometimes,
yeah.
And I just want to, and sometimes it really sucks to hear that rejection. You are allowed to feel upset. You're allowed to feel rejected, but you're not allowed, or you shouldn't be allowed, to disrespect your partner. Say, well, this is what we always do, so you should be doing this. Well, we're in a relationship, so you should want to do this. That's not a respectful discussion to be having, right? And so the rejection is understandable, but how you continue on in that conversation, it just ultimately leads to whether or not you respect your partner or not, right? Yeah. If you respect your partner, you're going to listen to their wishes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alicia. And if someone is threatening or making promises to you, that's non-consent, right? Related to what Alicia was talking about, that's pressure, right? That's coercion. And in order to have a freely given consent, we can't have that. We have to have unimpaired, uncoerced consent.
And I just want to talk a little bit about the threatening side, which is typically what we think about with coercion, versus the promise side. So the threatening would be, I'm not going to continue a relationship with you if you don't do this, right? Like we tend to think of when coercion is happening, that's what we tend to think about. But for the promises, I promise to take you shopping if you do this one thing for me. So that is the other side of it, and just things that we need to be cognizant about, but more things that you can discuss with your classroom afterwards. Bigger discussion. So age of consent in Canada, we're just going to generally go over this for intimate and sexual connections. So if you are under the age of 12 years old, you cannot consent to sexual activity. Now, if you are 12 to 13 years of age, you can consent to sexual activity within a 2-year age difference. So a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old would not be able to consent because that is larger than 2 years. So it has to be less than 2 years. 14 or 15-year-olds can experience sexual activity within a less than 5-year age difference. So yes, that would mean a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old would be able legally to engage in intimate connections. But I think we need to hold ourselves to not only the legal standards of consent, but also the more social and moral standards of consent, right? When we start to think about what is a 14-year-old doing versus what is an 18-year-old doing, there's going to be some power differences in that relationship, right? And so we just need to think about healthy relationships and consent and how we're giving consent, especially when we have such a vast age difference, especially in that with youth and people like you. Mm-hmm. And then 16-year-olds or older. So that is the age of consent in Canada. So you are able to consent, but there is some exceptions here. So exceptions are if that person is in a position of power or authority over you, or you're dependent on them. So like a family member, a teacher, a counselor, a coach, a religious leader, a facilitator of a program, you cannot consent to them because they do have that position of power or authority, or you are dependent on them for food, shelter, etc. It involves exploitative activities such as prostitution, trafficking, pornography. There's a payment process involved, so you cannot consent if you are being paid at that age, and if you're engaging in anal intimate connections, so anal sex. Unless you are a legal married couple, which in Canada you can do that at the age of 16 with parent consent. So consent is very important, but we really need to think about not only the legal definitions of consent, but also our moral and social definitions of consent. And I think that we can hold ourselves to much higher standards. Great. So substance usage. Lucas, did you want to go into this one?
Absolutely. So whether it's consuming alcohol or smoking and ingesting cannabis, you cannot legally consent when you're under the influence, right? And as Alicia was alluding to earlier, that's because it impairs your ability to think rationally and think critically and be aware of your surroundings. You're going to be less open and perceptive of these ongoing and continual yeses that you're going to be looking for when you're connecting it, especially in sexual relationships, right? And oftentimes in the media, it depicts something different and contrary to that. That like after people are ingesting these things, they seem to be fully capable and having a great time. But it's important to be critical of what the media that we watch and understand that that's a part of the performance, right? That's not actually how real life works. Yeah. And also something that Alicia was talking about again is that when you make a mistake, how is that impact going to be felt? So Alicia, would you be able to elaborate on this?
Definitely, yeah. So, you know, if you end up causing harm of any kind of level, how is that going to impact your partner?
Yeah.
And not only impact your partner's health, but also their mental well-being, right? When someone doesn't respect you, when someone doesn't listen to you, that sends a very loud message of harm to this individual, especially if they're your romantic partner, right? What about your perception from your peers? So if you harm someone, what are your peers going to think of you, right? And what about your school? You may get a criminal record from this if it leads to a criminal pursuit, right? So we need to start thinking about our job and educational opportunities. What about even your mental health and your well-being, knowing that you harmed someone and made this mistake, right? This is something that not only would impact a survivor lifelong, but also impact yourself. So it's really important to think about these are big decisions that we're making if we're engaging in intimate connections with folks, and then we're adding things like substance use onto it. It's kind of like a concoction of a harm potentially going to happen, right? So we need to be fully aware when we're engaging in these things. And I understand that especially in the latter stages of high school, there's parties that are happening and a lot of pressure to engage in things like this. But we really need to think about what could that impact be, not what our intentions are, but what is that impact going to be, not only on ourselves, our partners, but our friends, family, and community, right? So yeah, Lucas, do you want to go into these pressures that we may be feeling?
Thanks, Alicia. So the kinds of different sources of pressures that we could be receiving that interrupt healthy and safe relationships are from a plethora of people and groups in our life. We can receive them from our peers, right? And that can sound like, oh, like, don't you want to do this? Aren't we friends? Right? Or everybody's doing it, and the feeling that like you want to fit in with what everyone's doing, and that could look like a lot of different things. But how it ties with substance use is maybe you not being ready or feeling like comfortable to try something new in a space with people that you don't know very well, right? And that can, as Alicia was talking about, like lead to situations where harm is probably more probable, right? We can also receive pressures from family, right? And like what that could look like is really ugly, right? Like someone in your family like causing you harm, and then when you go to talk to your family and speak out about it, not being believed, right? Or having that family member say that you can't tell other family members because then they won't believe you and then they won't love you. Like these kind of insidious pressures that we can receive from family, and that being connected to disappointment and shame, right? Like that leading to really make that experience internalized and not be able to open up and reach out to other people, right? In online spaces and media, this could be dealing with really hateful comments and trolls, right? And people saying and sending you sexual messages saying, hey, do you want to meet up, or elements like that, right? Like from either strangers or people that you know who are older than you or have a higher like power than you, you're dependent on them. So that's what that pressure could look like online. And with cultural and social different pressures, this could look like similar to the peers, right? Aren't you a man? Or that's not what a girl would do. These kind of ways of pressuring and policing people based on the gender that they are and who they are, right? And how that relates to dating expectations, right? Is that like sometimes masculinity and being a man is really connected with having a lot of sex, right? So if you're engaging in intimate connections with men or people who aren't men, there could be this kind of implicit pressure that like you and your partner would have to engage intimately when you're not ready to, right? And maybe Alicia can speak to heterosexual and two-spirit and LGBTQ2+ relationships.
Yeah, certainly. So when we look at the expectations of dating, right, there's just so many rich undertones of like, well, if you're dating someone, you need to be doing these sexual types of things. Like, oh, you haven't done that yet. And so we can experience a lot of different pressures to engage in those activities, whether or not we're ready. So it's really important that we think about kind of our readiness and our ability to consent if we're not ready, right? So you're not able to. So within heterosexual relationships, we think back to the Disney movies, getting married and happily ever after. But what if that's not something that you want? What if that's not something you see with this high school lover? And then looking over to the 2S LGBTQ+ relationships, it's really hard to engage in relationships in high school, especially when you are the minority. And so thinking about those added layers of the online presence and social media and wanting to connect with older people because that's the only person in your region, right? And so we really need to think about these struggles and pressures and wants and needs, but also understanding them in the sense of consent and respectability. Like, how are we respecting ourselves and also respecting the person that we're with? So there's a lot of external pressures that which can definitely be parsed out more with the classroom, as we're just kind of giving you little tidbits, if you will. So please know that if you have experienced harm, your experience is certainly valid and you are important. You most certainly are not alone in this, and you are definitely worthy of help and support. You are worthy of that and you are allowed to have that. And there's a variety of different resources and supports that you can reach out to. So, obviously we have the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center here. We have our mending program, engaging men and boys and ending gender-based violence, as well as Niche Quinadat and the Indigenous supports that we have. But if you are a survivor or you're looking for support, or what it might look like to report to police, or what it may look like to access counseling, Survival Toolkit is a really great resource for that. You can also check out Planned Parenthood, Kids Help Phone, Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans Youth Line for LGBTQ supports, PFLAG Canada, which is about families with queer children. And then if you're having questions about your bodies, you're having questions about your relationships, questions about sex and safer barriers and STDs and the potential for pregnancy, Scarlet Teen is a really great resource that is created by youth for youth. So if you're wanting more information about that, that's a great online resource there. So to wrap things up, consent is every day. It's part of our everyday interactions, and it's certainly more than a yes or no. Especially when you think about it in the context of our intimate connections with other people, because consent is freely given, it's mutually agreed upon, it's enthusiastic and clear, so we have a clear understanding of what we're consenting to, and it can be repeated and can be reversed at any point. And we must respect people's answers, whether or not they want to engage or not engage in an activity. And dealing with rejection can be really difficult, but it's really important that it comes down to respecting the person where they are at. Age of consent laws are there to protect us, but we hold much more social responsibility, especially being grade 11 and 12s in high school. Everyone is looking up to you as the leaders of the school, as the leaders of the next generation. And so what type of relationships are you perpetuating, are you showing, right? What kind of values are you showing for the other folks in your school and your community about what you value in your partner, or to not have a partner, right? So, and sometimes we feel pressures to say yes, and that's okay. Know that your answer is valid, but know that it is not your fault if someone does not check in or doesn't listen to you. So if you are an educator, we most certainly appreciate if you were to fill out the survey that is connected to the schedule that was sent to you. And then finally, our support. So we do offer those 3 different ways of 24/7 crisis supports. So we have our texting line, and then Lucas, can you go over the rest?
Yeah, absolutely. So we also have a phone line available, and also a 24/7 web chat on our website there at kawarthasexualassaultcenter.com. So all these 3 lines are 24/7 access, and they're awesome. They're all awesome.
And on our website, you can get connected to all the different supports and services that we provide. And then with Niche Quinnidat, there's also a youth group that's happening. So if you are connected to Indigenous healing in any capacity, there's a youth group that is happening every Monday from 4 to 6 p.m. looking at traditional medicine teaching, self-care, and grandfather teachings. So we want to thank you all for tuning in today. And thank you, Lucas.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and thanks everyone for being here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and take care. Goodbye.